Good morning, everyone. And I'm speaking to you from the Gundungurra and Darug country. But the Wild Mountain Collective, that is a project that I set up as part of the Blue Mountains Creative Arts Network, takes in the whole of the Greater Blue Mountains. So we also would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people who occupy the land to the west of the Blue Mountains, and particularly the city of Lithgow, where I was born. We see ourselves as building on the songline tradition of Australia's First Nations people. And I take really as my starting point a quote from Richard Tarnas, who's a philosopher who's written about Western cultural perspectives. Our worldview is not simply the way we look at the world. It reaches inwards to shape our innermost sense of being. It deeply configures our psychic and somatic experience, the patterns of our sensing, knowing, and interacting with our world. And from this point of view, and I guess from my own experience, I think the greatest challenge facing we white fellas, non-Indigenous people of the world, particularly of Australia, is the hegemonic nature of the Western worldview. We just take it for granted that it's the way to see and think and feel. But we also are in a country that is shaped by a very ancient tradition of a different knowledge system, that of the First Nations people of this country. And one of the really inspiring things about today is that we've got a whole new generation of First Nations intellectuals, creatives, thinkers, filmmakers, poets, writers, dancers, who are building this bridge between the Western way of knowing and the First Nations people's way of knowing. And David spoke about that himself, about this whole principle of reconnecting. And to me, this is the greatest challenge we face. It's a knowledge systems challenge that has to underpin all of the scientific and other sort of activities we do. So we have Leanne Tobin, a Darug artist, as our patron. And if we want to understand the songline tradition, I would like to recommend to the audience here, there's two books you should absolutely read. One is called Song Spirals by the Guwe group of women of Northeast Arnhem Land. And the other is Songlines, The Power and Promise by Margot Neal Nawagara and Lynn Kelly. Because the inspiring thing about the songlines is they kept this knowledge tradition alive through the arts. They sang it, they danced it, they story told it, they performed it through ceremony. And it's an oral tradition of incredible power that created this fundamental sense of interbeing that describes the First Nations way of relating to country. Next slide. So one of the ways that we can do this is to actually support initiatives by First Nations people. And one of them is Regenerative Songlines Australia, which is calling for all of us to contribute projects to the ecosystem that they're seeking to build. And another one is First Nation, it's called Songline Dream, or Futures Dreaming, sorry. And I think one of the members of that group is on the Planetary Art Initiative Advisory Committee. So we should get behind these initiatives that are actually being led by First Nations people. And in the spirit of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, they're inviting non-Indigenous Australians to join them. So for me, it's time we followed in their footsteps rather than simply paying acknowledgement to them. Next slide, please. So one of the ways, as the Wild Mountain Collective, we're just a small voluntary organisation of people. We're just a collection, a loose collection of artists and musicians and thinkers. So we do just different things. So one of the ideas we do is exploring idea seminars, and working with one of my friends up here in the mountains, Lorraine Shannon, we put on a series of seminars, and here you see one working with the wonderful Janet Lawrence and Louise Fowler, who were sharing their work as eco-artists and coming all the way up to the Blue Mountains for free and giving us the benefit of their experience. Next slide, please. Then another one of the activities we do, we call it Encountering the Wild. And we carry out this as a multi-arts event. at the Gallery H site at Dargan, which is at the Monkey Creek Escarpment near Lithgow, where we bring together art, an art exhibition of sculpture and paintings, live music, and together we always have a community conversation. In the first year we ran it, we invited Wayne Brennan, a First Nations rock ecologist, to come and talk to us about rock art and culture of the Blue Mountains. And the second year we invited Leanne Tobin and Jacinta Tobin to come and speak with a non-Indigenous anthropologist, Inga Reeby, about this whole business of how do you know across cultures? How do you see other cultures from their side rather than trying to see it through the lens of your own culture? The next slide, please. Another project that I'm working on is with a Bunjalung Yagul artist, Janelle Randall Court. And she's always had a long interest in how do we rethink our whole relationship to domestic waste. So Janelle's got a project that's running through from December through till June next year, funded by Wentworth Health as part of the bushfire recovery money, where she's showing a film screening in December on Wasteland, which is a documentary about using the art to work with waste pickers in Brazil to reimagine and reframe the relationship to domestic waste. And then she's running a series of workshops, arts workshops with community, where people will actually directly work with recovered waste to create artworks. And then we'll have an exhibition of those. Next slide, please. Another project that I've just begun working on with OWN, which is the Older Women's Network Blue Mountains, is we're sort of diving into the whole sort of housing crisis, which to me is a sort of a reflection of the pathology of the current kind of economy that we're running. To look at two particular groups here in the Greater Blue Mountains that are affected, the low income people working in the creative arts sector, and their incomes are less than half the average income of Australians. And then older single women, who are the fastest growing group of people facing homelessness. So we're sort of looking into this, trying to contextualize it as part of this general pattern of how do we rethink our whole relationship to economy, society, and one another in a spirit of interbeing in our relationship to country and community. Next slide, please. Another project that, or event that I'm working on, which reflects my Buddhist interest, is Calling the Earth to Witness. And this was an event that was designed originally as part of the Festival of Resilience, which has now been postponed. And it features, you can see on the lower, Kunshot Gyaltsen, who it's the Tibetan refugee community. There's a small community of these people living in Katoomba. So Kunshot is an artist and he's a photographer, and he's from Amdo, which is in northern Tibet. And so he's also a wonderful nomadic singer. Then there's Kempo Sering Tashi, who you see there with his drum and dodge and bell doing a Buddhist ceremony, who lives here in Katoomba. On the left is Jenny Key, and the famous Australian artist who lives at Blackheath. And then on the right, down the bottom, is Chosm Tenzin, who's a Canadian anthropologist who worked with the nuns in Nung Chen and now lives in Sydney. So all of them are exploring what it means when the Buddha achieved enlightenment and he called the earth to witness his understanding of the causes of human suffering and how to escape that suffering by developing our own inherent capacity for inner wisdom. So that will happen next year as part of the Festival of Resilience, but also we'll put that event on in Sydney early next year when we'll launch two books that I managed to self-publish during our lockdown, and one of which is the history of East Tibet between 1855 and 1955 through the lives of a number of spiritual masters and political actors. And the other book is my memoir, The Call of the Dakini, which is the inner call to really face life's troubles and dance in a way of flowing with life, in answering a call to the yearning for our own wisdom awareness. Next slide, please. This is another project the Wild Mountain Collective put on with some funding from Create New South Wales, called Timescapes, which we did in collaboration with Sharon Howard from the Gangang Gallery in Lithgow and Henrik Topolnitsky, who runs Gallery H. He's a sculptor. So our contribution was to create a soundscape. And for this, we interviewed a whole range of people. The people that we interviewed for this were Sharon Riley and Patsy Wolfenden from Lithgow, who are Wiradjuri people, Chris Tobin and Lex Dad from the Blue Mountains, who are both Darug people, and then non-Indigenous people, Sean Butler and Rich Evans. So we tried to explore through these voices a different way of understanding our relationship to country in the context of the bushfires that ravaged the Blue Mountains. But also we used it to revision what the future of a place like Lithgow and the surrounding area might be, taking account of like this reframing and refocusing our whole relationship, not just to nature, but to the economy. Because one of my frustrations is that we keep seeing the future as just a switch to renewable energy. But actually we have to have a complete revolution in consciousness about the way we think of society. We have to embrace ideas like post-growth economics. We have to get over the endless focus on consumption and growth. And this whole idea of Australia as a renewable energy superpower, whatever that could mean. So for me, this challenge we face is the challenges of how we think about who we are in the world. And we need to understand this by following in the footsteps of the ancient First Nations cultures that shaped this country. Next slide, please. So I call this, how do we go beyond the great unraveling that we're now witnessing in the world as we face the challenge of the climate catastrophe, the environmental degradation, species extinction, and rising political violence and tragic economic inequality. So for me, the question is, how do we support and follow leadership from our First Nations creatives to tell this new story of regenerative living in a multitude of different ways, and how powerful the arts can be in doing this through the different ways we tell stories, particularly in film, in music, in exhibitions, really any way we can to sort of change people's consciousness. Thank you.